to Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 35. And we'll remember that last week we were at the point where Jesus was telling the disciples that if anybody sins against you, talk to them privately, and if that doesn't work, talk to them in a group. If that doesn't work, talk to them before the entire church. And then this is the follow-up. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children, and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I'll pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, pay me what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me and I'll pay you. But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I have mercy on you? And in anger his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Both Hemingway, Tolstoy, and a number of other authors say that real writing, real honest writing comes from your life stories. That it's not honest unless it comes from the truth that you've lived out. And so when you look at certain writers, you can see by what they write and how they write the kind of lives that they've led. So for one example, Shel Silverstein. Shel Silverstein was a Chicago guy, and he wrote these nice, uplifting yet deep children's poems, right? A Light in the Attic, Where the Sidewalk Ends, The Giving Tree. Okay, so these uplifting good poems, so you can see that he really didn't have a lot of suffering in his life, very likely, so he could draw from those happy places and write about happy and encouraging stuff. Very motivational. But on the flip side, there are a number of writers who write kind of deep, depressing, sad stuff, even though it might be kind of satire or irony, but yet it is kind of deep and, well, morose, I guess you'd say. Let's take, for example, the songwriter who did A Boy Named Sue. Okay, very famous song by Johnny Cash, and it's a hilarious song. I love it. But when you think about it, this is a song about a man who's out to kill his father because he gave him a really bad name that caused him to get his butt kicked a lot of times in life, right? So his dad leaves him as a kid, and it basically explains that, well, I gave you that name because I knew I wouldn't be around, so you had to toughen up one way or the other, right? Kind of a sad song when you think about it, about abandonment and different issues like this, and wanting to get back at his father. And then that same writer wrote another song for Johnny Cash that wasn't nearly as famous, but called 25 Minutes to Go, about a prisoner on death row who had 25 minutes to go before he went to the gallows. And so each line is 24 minutes to go, 23 minutes to go. I hear the warden coming, I've got 22 minutes to go, and it just goes on down the line until the priest comes and it's all over. So this is kind of deep. So you can tell that this writer probably had some difficult times in his life, and indeed he did. This writer, in contrast to Shel Silverstein, the mother of his daughter's name was Shoshana, and the mother of his daughter died when his daughter was to turn 5 the next day, the day before her 5th birthday. His His girlfriend, I don't think they were married, died. 6 years later, that same daughter, Shoshana, died at the age of 11 of a brain aneurysm. So this guy's got some deep stuff to draw from. Right? This same guy used to be derided by his own father, so we can kind of understand now this boy named Susta, kind of be called mamsy-pamsy, a wimp, told that he was never going to succeed in life because he liked to do illustrations and draw cartoons and do different stuff and write this music and whatever, and that he was never going to amount to anything because, of course, you can't make money off the arts, so he should stop this delusional dream of his and go and do something worthwhile and quit wasting his time. And so it was when this man drew some cartoons up and took them to, of all people, Playboy, and gave them to the secretary there at the desk, and walked away, forgot about them for about a month. And then a month later, he goes back to get his writings because he never heard anything. He figured they'd not even probably been looked at. And lo and behold, Hugh Hefner himself is there and says, "Oh no, we're keeping all these." Gives him a check right on the spot. He said, "This is good stuff. In fact, I want you to keep writing for us." And so he goes home to his father with that check. His father's sitting at the kitchen table. He plops it down. He says, "There, I did what you told me I could never do. I'm gone." And he moved out. This man's name is Shel Silverstein. See, Shel Silverstein had both places to draw from. And this is Shel's story of going to the dark places to bring out that which we create and bring into the light, so it can be redeemed, so it can be turned into something good, something encouraging. That is the story of Shel Silverstein. That is our story. And that's the story of the Hebrew people. Imagine for 430 years, the Israel nation, which really hasn't become a nation yet, is growing and growing. And of course, Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh, decides that he's getting a little bit nervous about all of these Hebrew people just popping up on the scene. And so he decides to enslave them and put them to work in building things in his empire. And they have no recollection of God, of Yahweh. This is something that we often miss in reading these texts. But you go from Genesis, where the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and everything is about God, into Exodus, where these people, they don't remember who's Yahweh. They don't remember anything about that. They don't remember a whole lot about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Moses comes on the scene and says, "Don't you remember the God who promised our forefather Abraham that we would become a great nation? How can we become a great nation when we're here enslaved, being complacent, thinking that our lives are good enough the way they are? You guys have to come together with me, and we have to leave this place." And oh boy, did they want to kick him in the rear end. I'm not going to meddle with Pharaoh's business. I'm going to stay right here. We get fed, we get clothing, it's fine. It's not the best life in the world. We're treated like poo, but at least we get a living, and we get to live. So let's leave well enough alone. This is good enough. And Moses says, "Can't you remember that God who promised your forefathers? Can't you sense the presence of that God within you, calling you to something greater than this?" And finally, after the Pharaoh was hit with 10 plagues, finally they say, "Okay, fine, let's do this." And Pharaoh says, "Okay, fine, I've had enough. I'm going to let you go." What happens? They're on their way out of town, they're running away, and Pharaoh says, "Wait a minute. I don't have to listen to anybody." And he calls up these legions of Egyptian soldiers with their chariots and sends them to take off after him and kill every one of them. Show him who's boss. So imagine these Hebrew people, as they're heading away, all of a sudden they hear it. They hear the hoof beats. The ground's starting to shake, and they hear the Egyptians coming, and they know right away what's happened. They know that they're done for. But they're making ground, they got a head start, they're taking off, and they come up over the hill, and then there it is. The Red Sea stretched out before them, blocking their path. They're in big trouble. And they turn around and they start complaining to Moses, "Why did you do this? We were good enough back there. At least we were alive, and now you have brought us to our death. You made us run away from that, and here we are. We're going to die like sheep on the seashore. Why couldn't you have just left well enough alone? And Moses cries out to God. He says, they're right. Why did you call me to do this? What's the matter with you? What are we going to do? And God says what? Do something about it. Take your staff, raise it up over the waters, and do something about it. I'll give you the power, but you got to do it. And so Moses raises his staff, and the waters part, and they start running. Can you imagine how it must have been with the water up there, just roaring along the sides, but not moving, threatening to come down on them, but just staying right where it was, frozen? And they're running through, and they get through to the other side. And then as the Egyptian soldiers are all filling into the sea, comes back down. Now, whether this is a literal event or a figurative event doesn't matter, because the power is still there in the event. And when they come out the other side, immediately, and they write this song. God, you kicked the butts of the Egyptians. You showed Pharaoh who's lost. What of all the gods is greater than you? You rock, dude. We're glad to be your people. We forgot about you for 430 years, but hey, we're glad to be back in the club. But then what? Celebrating all night long, dancing, singing, campfires. Sun starts to come up. And what happens? They can see. They can see that there's nothing before them except for a parched, dry desert. And for 40 years, they're going to wander in that desert. Wander because they always flirted with the idea of going back. See, here we are again. And they complain to Moses again, why did you bring us here to die in the desert? You could have left us there. It was good enough. You could have left well enough alone, and now you've brought us here to die. And so the manna comes down, right? And then they complain again. We have to eat this stuff every stinking day? This stuff is terrible. We're tired of it. Give us some meat. Okay, you want some meat? I'll shove it down your throat. Bam, they get a bunch of meat, right? Always complaining. Always wanting to go back to good enough. Always wanting to go back where well enough was good enough. Because they didn't know what to do with the new stuff that they had found. It's always easier to go back to what we know, even if it's not good, even if it's disturbing, even if it bothers us, it's still comfortable. It still feels like home in that little bed of complacency, because that is something that's familiar. The interesting thing is, here the Hebrew people are afraid of the sea before they cross it. They think it's going to be sounding their death knell. They get across. They want to get away from it because it was a scary place, bad memories, just don't want to go back there. But what happens? You gotta drink. You gotta bathe if you're going to live. Not a whole lot of water in the desert. Guess what? You got to go back to that place that really messed with your psyche because you need it. You got to go back there if you're going to get some water. So if you're going to live, you have to go back to the dark places. And you have to redeem them. You have to make them something different than what they were the first time. And although you want to go back there and say that this is good enough, just let me cross back over and go where I was and be happy there, you go back to that place with a new mindset, saying this is not good enough. And even though I'm geographically and physically in the same spot, it's not good enough. I'm going to make progress right here where I am. Because it's never, ever good enough. If they would have said it was good enough, you never would have heard any story of Saul or David. You never would have heard of anybody named Jesus. Therefore, there would be no Christianity. We wouldn't be sitting here today. Who knows what we would be religiously? I have no idea. But none of this this stuff would have come to pass if they would have stayed in Egypt and said, "This is good enough, Moses. Get out of here before you get us in trouble. We've been here 430 years. We've done just fine. We can be here for 430 more." See, then never, ever, ever would the story have been written if they would have just decided that that was okay, that that was good enough. After the celebration, there was despair, but they redeemed it. They turned it into something good. They took that which was dark and turned it into light. They took that which was scary and turned it into something that was hope. And they continued to write the story, because sometimes you can go back to those places and it doesn't mean complacency. It doesn't mean putting your head under the covers and crawling into bed and saying, "Heck with it, I don't even want to see the light of the world today." Sometimes you feel that way, don't we? They didn't do it. Even though they were still there, it was a different story. Everything looked differently when they went back there the second time. A man named Dan Cherry. Dan Cherry was an F-4 Phantom pilot during the Vietnam conflict. And he was in a number of dogfights and shot down a lot of MiGs, a lot of MiG-17s, MiG-21s. Shot them down over the forests, the canopy of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And he remembered one time, because all of the other dogfights were pretty impersonal. He'd shoot the plane, launch a Sidewinder or whatever missiles it was equipped with at it, blow it up, it would be all done. Just bits and pieces of fires falling down into the forest and the jungle below. But he remembered one time that a man, the pilot of the MiG-21 that he shot down, was actually able to eject before the plane exploded. And so he saw this man, both arms broken, in the seat, parachuting down, floating down through the canopy into the jungle. And he always remembered this guy. Every once in a while, he'd think about him. Until one day, he was touring a number of VFW facilities, and there, I'll be darned, if the very plane, not one like it, the plane that he flew in Vietnam was parked right there in the yard of the VFW. It's like a museum piece. He remembered the insignia, his name was right there inside of the plane. He had no idea how they'd gotten a hold of it, where it had come from. All he knew was when CSAC out, he was gone. He didn't know what happened to the plane. And he started to think about that man that he shot down again, and he told himself, you know what? I don't know, this is a lot of years later, but I'm going to find out what happened to him. And so, in 2008, he's in Ho Chi Minh City talking to Mr. Nguyen, who he had shot down 35 years before, 40 years before. They went to his house. They had dinner together. He met his family. He held his 1-year-old grandson in his arms. He went back to a place that had meant bad, dark things, and he redeemed it. He turned it into something good, and he and Mr. Nguyen both consciously made the decision to take a situation that had made them enemies and to turn it on its head intentionally, to make it so that they were friends. They redeemed the situation. Mark Twain had it right when he said 20 years from now, we will not be disappointed for the things that we did. We will be disappointed in ourselves for the things that we didn't do. He says, so take up the bow lines, set sail with the trade winds, get out of the safe harbor, and have the courage to dream, to hope, and to achieve. This is our message today. I usually am talking about social justice and the things that we need to do for the people out there, but it's said that hurt people hurt people. Think about that. Hurt people hurt people. There comes a time sometimes we need to just sit still and take care of ourselves, because what good are we to others if we don't take care of ourselves? How can we possibly be of help to others if we're not taking care of our own soul? And so in this, we We have to sometimes go back to those dark places and redeem them, turn them into something good, look ourselves in the face in the mirror, and tell ourselves that it is not good enough. I am supposed to be somebody, and I'm going to become that person because that is who I was made to be. That is who I was called to be, because never, ever is complacency good enough. So keeping on this theme of doing songs that are different,